welcome to Daily Life in the Past. Here, we explore how ordinary people lived before modern technology and comfort shaped everyday life. If you enjoy learning about the past, feel free to leave a comment and let us know where you are watching from. And if you would like to support the channel, a like or subscription is always appreciated. For most of human history, hunger was not a rare emergency. It was a normal part of life, returning again and again in small, everyday ways. Many people lived close to the edge, where food was enough in good seasons and thin in bad ones. Even when there was food, it was often the same food, cooked in the same ways, day after day. This is a study of repetitive diets, why they happened, what they looked like, and how limited access shaped what people ate. It is also about what hunger meant in the past. Hunger was not only the extreme famine seen in history books, it was also the quiet, regular feeling of not quite being full, of stretching stored grain, of watering down porridge, and of waiting for the next harvest. To understand food repetition in historical societies, we need to start with a simple truth. Most people depended on a few staple crops. A staple is a food that is reliable, easy to store, and provides most daily calories. Staples were usually grains or starchy roots because they could be grown in bulk and kept for months. In many places, the main staples were wheat, barley, rye, oats, millet, sorghum, and rice. In parts of the Americas, potatoes and maize were central. In other regions, yams, plantains, or other starchy crops carried the basic diet. These staples did not always taste exciting, but they kept people alive. When a society depends heavily on a staple, meals naturally repeat. The staple becomes bread, porridge, gruel, noodles, flat cakes, or beer. The exact form changes, but the structure stays the same. A large share of the plate is the staple, and small additions provide flavor and extra nutrients when available. Food repetition was also built into the way farming worked. Many communities planted once or twice a year and harvested once or twice a year. That meant there was a cycle, plenty right after harvest, then slow decline as stores were used up, then a dangerous gap before the next harvest. That gap is sometimes called the hungry season. It appears in many farming societies across time. People might still be eating, but the food is thinner, smaller, and less varied. Meals become more repetitive because households protect their remaining stores. Now consider how food was stored. Before modern refrigeration and global shipping, storage was a major limit. Fresh foods like fruit, leafy greens, and many vegetables were seasonal. Meat was hard to keep without salting, drying, smoking, or fermenting. Milk spoiled quickly unless it was turned into cheese, yogurt, or butter. Even grain could be lost to dampness, insects, rodents, and mold. So a household's diet often narrowed to whatever could be stored safely. Grain stores, dried legumes, salted fish, dried meat when possible, and preserved vegetables became the backbone of daily eating. Another limit was cooking fuel. Firewood, charcoal, and dried dung were not free. In some landscapes, fuel was scarce, and that shaped cooking styles. Long-simmered stews and porridges were efficient because they could soften tough grains and legumes and stretch small amounts of fat or flavor. A single pot could feed a family, and the same pot could be reheated and added to over several days. A further limit was equipment. An oven for bread might require a communal structure or a wealthy household. Many people cooked with a pot over a hearth. That pushes diets toward boiled staples, soups, stews, porridges, and gruels. When people in the past ate the same thing, it did not always mean the exact same recipe. It often meant the same base, with small changes. A grain porridge might be thick one day and thin the next. It might include onions when the garden had them, or it might be plain. It might have a little fat on special days. But the foundation stayed the same. To see how this worked, we can look across several historical settings. In many parts of medieval Europe, grain dominated the diet. Bread was a central food, but not everyone had easy access to an oven. Many poor households relied on pottage, a thick soup or stew, and on thin porridges or gruels. These foods used grains like oats, barley, or rye, and could be stretched with water. When vegetables were available, they might be added, along with herbs for taste. In better times, there might be peas, beans, or a little salted meat for flavor. Another key part of the medieval diet in parts of Europe was ale or small beer. This was not always drunk for entertainment. It was a way to consume calories from grain in liquid form, and in many places it was considered safer than some water sources. Small beer could be part of daily life, even for children, because it was low in alcohol and served as a common drink. When bread, pottage, and ale form the base, meals become repetitive by design. Even if there were different breads, different grains, or different pot herbs, the daily structure remained grain-centered. In ancient Rome, many ordinary people also relied on grain as the main source of calories. One early Roman staple was a porridge made from grains such as emmer. Bread became more common later, especially where baking infrastructure existed. But for many people, a grain-based base food stayed central. Oil, vegetables, and sometimes fish or small amounts of meat could supplement it. The point is not that everyone ate poorly all the time. The point is that the dependable daily calories came from grain, and so the most common meals repeated. In the ancient Near East, grain and bread held similar importance. Bread could be so central that the word for bread could also mean food in general. Alongside bread, people made porridge and gruel from ground grain. This is another example of the same pattern, a storable staple processed into simple daily foods repeated over time. In the Andes under the Inca and related societies, we see the pattern in a different climate and landscape. Here, potatoes were a major staple, and people developed methods to store them long-term, including freeze-drying into chuño. Maize also mattered, as did grains like quinoa. Much cooking involved boiling or roasting. Even with variety across regions and social classes, the basic diet relied heavily on a few main crops. When potatoes and maize carry the calorie load, they appear again and again in daily meals. In West Africa, across different societies and time periods, staples often included millet, sorghum, yams, and other starchy foods, with sauces and soups built around them. Over the early modern period, crops from the Americas such as maize and cassava spread and became widely used in many regions. Here again the pattern holds. A few reliable staples form the base, and meals repeat, while sauces, greens, fish, or meat, when available, provide flavor and extra nutrition. In Japan during the Edo period, rice became a strong dietary center for many people, especially in areas where rice was available and used for tax and status. Meals often included rice with miso soup and pickles or other small side dishes. The side dishes could vary, but rice anchored the meal. When one food is eaten at nearly every meal, repetition becomes the normal pattern. Across these examples, repetition is not an accident. It is a logical outcome of how food systems worked. Now we can turn to hunger as a normal experience. Hunger in the past often came in layers. The first layer is everyday hunger. This is when people eat enough to survive, but not enough to feel full for long. In physically demanding lives, calorie needs were high. Many workers burned large amounts of energy in fields, workshops, mines, or carrying loads. If the staple portion was too small, or if the diet lacked fats and proteins, people could feel hungry again quickly. The second layer is seasonal hunger. Food supplies rose and fell across the year. After harvest, there might be fuller meals and more bread. As months passed, stores shrank, households began to ration. Porridge might be made thinner. Bread might be smaller or made with lower quality grain. People might rely more on foraging, on famine foods, or on mixing in other ingredients to stretch flour. The third layer is crisis hunger. A run of bad harvests, war, flooding, drought, or disease among livestock could push communities into severe shortage. Grain prices could rise sharply, making basic food unaffordable for those without land or savings. Even if food existed somewhere, it might not be reachable or purchasable. In pre-modern societies, transport was slower and storage was fragile. This made local shortages more common. A bad harvest in one region could cause serious hardship if trade routes could not fill the gap quickly. Understanding hunger also means understanding inequality. The same society could include both people who were well-fed and people who were often hungry. Land ownership, wages, rents, taxes, and debts shaped access to food. For many peasants and laborers, a large share of household resources went towards staples. If grain prices rose, people had few options. They might sell possessions, reduce meals, or migrate temporarily. They might borrow grain at harsh terms. This is one reason hunger could repeat, not only because food production was uncertain, but because economic structures pushed the poorest into constant risk. Food repetition is closely tied to this economic reality. When budgets are tight, households focus spending on the cheapest calories. Staples are usually the cheapest way to get energy. Variety costs more. Even in normal years, many households aimed first to secure enough grain for bread or porridge. Only after that could they think about extra foods. That creates a standard pattern, a starchy base every day, with occasional additions. Another important factor is nutrition. A repetitive staple diet can keep people alive, but it can also produce deficiencies if it lacks key nutrients. For example, a diet heavily based on grains without enough legumes, animal products, or varied vegetables may be low in certain amino acids, vitamins, and minerals. Societies often developed food pairings that improved nutrition, like grains with beans or lentils. Fermentation, soaking, and certain cooking methods could also improve digestibility and nutrient availability. But these solutions were not always available, and they could break down under pressure. When people are forced to eat only the bare staple, without the usual additions, health problems become more likely. This is why historical hunger is not only about empty stomachs. It is also about thin diets that weaken people over time. Repetition also came from cultural habit and tradition. Once a staple becomes central, recipes and tastes form around it. People learn many ways to prepare the same base food. In that sense, repetition can be normal and even comforting within a community. The problem is not repetition by itself. The problem is repetition without enough quantity and without the usual supporting foods. We should also address the difference between rural and urban diets. In rural areas, families might grow their own staples and keep small gardens. They might have access to milk from a goat or cow, eggs from chickens, or occasional meat. They could forage for wild greens, berries, nuts, or mushrooms when the environment allowed. But rural life could also be fragile. A family might owe rent or taxes in grain, reducing what they could eat. A single failed harvest could remove both food and seed for next year. In cities, many people relied on markets. Urban diets could include bread from bakers and food from street sellers, but poor workers were exposed to price spikes. When grain prices rose, city hunger could grow quickly. Urban systems sometimes tried to stabilize staples. Authorities might regulate bread weights and prices, or manage grain supplies. This could reduce unrest, but it could not fully remove the basic vulnerability to harvest failures and supply disruptions. Food repetition also shows up in institutional settings. Armies often relied on grain rations because grain was compact, storable, and could be issued in measured amounts. Soldiers might receive wheat and then bake or boil it. The daily food might be monotonous, with occasional meat, oil, or local foods depending on supply. Monasteries, workhouses, and other institutions often served simple, repeatable meals that could be made in bulk. Gruel, bread, and soup appear again and again in records because they were practical for feeding many people at low cost. Now, consider how climate shaped repetition and hunger. In many regions, a few key weather events could decide the year. Too much rain could ruin grain before harvest. Cold could prevent ripening. Drought could shrink yields and reduce pasture for animals. When livestock suffered, people lost meat, milk, and traction animals for ploughing. In parts of Europe, the early 14th century included years of severe trouble, including major famine tied to cold, wet conditions. In the late 17th century, Northern Europe experienced catastrophic famine conditions in parts of Finland and surrounding regions, linked to harsh climate and failed harvests. These are extreme examples, but they sit on top of a broader pattern. Smaller shortages and hungry seasons were common, even in less dramatic years. Technology mattered too. Improvements in tools, crop rotation, and storage could reduce hunger, but progress was slow and uneven. Where yields were low and reserves were small, people had little buffer. Trade could help, but it also had limits. Moving large amounts of grain required ships, carts, animals, roads, and security. Trade networks could fail during war, storms, piracy, or political breakdown. So even societies with active trade could still experience local hunger. Another reason meals repeated is that many food systems were built around risk management. A household could not gamble on delicate crops that might fail or spoil quickly. Instead, they invested labor in what was most reliable, the staple. A family might plant barley instead of a more fragile grain, or rely on hardy crops suited to local soils. This choice improved survival, but reduced variety. Food repetition was also connected to labor time. Making a wide variety of dishes takes time and extra ingredients. When most people spent long days working, simpler meals were practical. A pot of porridge or stew could be prepared without complex steps. Now let us look closely at what repetitive diets often looked like on the table. In grain-based societies, a very common pattern was a starchy base, bread, porridge, gruel, noodles, or rice. A liquid or semi-liquid dish, soup, pottage, broth, or stew, often using the same grain base or using legumes. A small flavor and nutrient addition, onions, garlic, herbs, cabbage, greens, beans, peas, or lentils. A fat source when possible, olive oil, animal fat, butter, or sesame oil depending on region. Occasional animal protein, fish, eggs, dairy, or small amounts of meat, often preserved. A drink, water, beer, thin ale, or other fermented drinks. When times were good, these additions could be regular. When times were hard, many of these items shrank or disappeared. In root crop-based societies, a common pattern was a starchy base, potatoes, yams, cassava, plantains, or maize products. A sauce or stew, often built from local greens, legumes, or small amounts of fish or meat. Preserved reserves, dried or fermented forms that could last through lean months. The same meal might appear again and again, with changes mainly in portion size and in the sauce. It is also important to recognize that repetition did not mean there was no culinary knowledge. People knew how to make staples taste better with salt, fermentation, souring, herbs, spices where available, and careful cooking. But access to salt, oil, and spices was uneven. Salt could be expensive or difficult to obtain in some places, and without salt, food is harder to preserve and harder to season. So the ability to break monotony often depended on trade and wealth. Now, how did people cope with hunger and repetition? One method was stretching. Families added water to soups and porridges. They mixed grains. They used lower quality flour or added non-grain fillers. Another method was substitution. When grain ran low, people turned to other foods roots, wild plants, acorns in some regions, or bark bread in severe northern famines. These foods could keep people alive, but were often less digestible and could cause sickness. A third method was preserving. Drying, smoking, salting, fermenting, and pickling turned seasonal foods into supplies for later. This helped reduce the worst hunger, but preservation required salt, containers, knowledge, and time. A fourth method was social support. Communities sometimes relied on charity, communal storage, or religious institutions. But these systems could be overwhelmed in widespread crises. A fifth method was movement. People migrated for seasonal work, left rural areas for towns, or moved to regions with better harvests. Migration could be a survival strategy, but it carried risks. All of these methods show that hunger was not simply no food. It was an ongoing management problem. To understand why repetition was so common, it helps to compare past diets with modern expectations. Today, many people in wealthy societies expect regular variety, different fruits in winter, fresh foods daily, meat or dairy often, and packaged goods that last. These expectations are supported by refrigeration, industrial farming, and global trade. In earlier periods, variety was harder to maintain. Even wealthy households were limited by season and by preservation methods. Poor households were far more limited. This does not mean people in the past were always starving. Many lived within stable routines where the staple provided enough energy most of the time. But it does mean that hunger, in the form of frequent shortfalls and seasonal thinning, was familiar. It also means that repeating meals was not only normal, but necessary. A final point concerns memory and record keeping. Historical records often focus on dramatic events, major famines, riots over bread, or royal feasts. But the most important reality for most people was the middle ground, the ordinary diet that repeated, and the ordinary hunger that came and went. When we study repetitive diets, we learn about the limits of pre-modern food systems. We see how agriculture, climate, storage, cooking technology, trade, and inequality shaped daily life. We also see that hunger is not one single experience. Hunger can be a short feeling before the next meal. It can be a long season of smaller portions. It can be a crisis where food prices rise beyond reach. And it can be the slow weakening that comes from a narrow diet. Across historical societies, the core pattern stays steady. A few staples carried most calories. Those staples were prepared in simple, repeatable ways. Variety depended on season, wealth, and local ecology. And because reserves were limited and risks were high, many people lived with recurring hunger as a normal part of the year. Understanding this helps us read the past more clearly. It shows how closely survival was tied to crops, weather, and storage. It explains why so many traditional cuisines are built around grains, roots, soups, and simple breads. And it helps us recognize that repetition was not a failure of imagination. It was the realistic answer to the world people lived in.